The Government of Canada has approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project.
The Prime Minister selling access and influence to billionaire communist donors.
The proposed legislation, which is introduced today, seeks to legalize, strictly regulate, and restrict access to cannabis.
Well, a lot has changed for Justin Trudeau's Liberal government in just the past few months. A new opposition leader and, of course, a new and unpredictable counterpart in the White House. There was a lot of action inside the House of Commons, too. The electoral reform reversal was the first big blemish on the Liberal campaign record. Only Rachel Notley and Christy Clark seemed very happy about those pipeline approvals, and the cash for access kerfuffle dominated question period for days. But the government eventually responded to the criticism with new fundraising rules. It also made big steps toward legalizing pot, another major election promise. So what to make of the last parliamentary session? Let's assess with the Sunday Scrum. Susan Riley, John Ibbitson, Katie O'Malley, all at their perch in the nation's capital today. Let's start with the positive for the government. What was their biggest legislative win? Susan.
Well, I'm going to say their biggest political win has been the way they've handled Trump. I think from Chrystia Freeland's, landmark speech on foreign policy a couple of weeks ago to the kind of, blitz that Liberal cabinet ministers are doing south of the border, I think to the extent, actually, that Bill Morneau, the cabinet minister, the finance minister, is in Washington for the wedding of Steve Mnuchin, the American Treasury Secretary. So they've formed close bonds. It's been very deliberate. It's been very exhaustive, and I think it's been very successful.
Okay. John.
Well, in terms of overall policy, I agree that so far, and a big caveat, so far, this government is managing this new rogue president well. But the question was legislative, and if we are going to talk about legislatively what they've done in Parliament, certainly the most important bill they passed was, for all intents and purposes, the first one, the budget bill, the first budget bill. The second budget bill was a sleeper. But the first one, which made some changes to the Income Tax Act to raise taxes on the rich and give a tax break to the middle class. There were changes as well to childcare spending. But of course, the big thing was this massive infrastructure program, tens and tens of billions of dollars to be spent over a decade, and the massive $30 billion a year deficit that we're saddled with as a result of it. Now, you can say it was also their biggest failure if you don't believe in deficits, and I'm not a fan of them myself. But certainly it's the most important thing they did. Nothing they've done since is important as their very first bill.
Katie, what do you think was the most successful legislative achievement for this government?
So I'm going to go to something fairly recent and that actually also hasn't passed yet, and that is the introduction and rollout of the National Security Bill that we saw last week, which was specifically the, I would say, long-awaited response of this government to C-51, which was the Conservatives' anti-terror bill, which you might recall was quite controversial. The Liberals had, while in opposition, supported some elements of it, but they kept promising that if we get into government, we're going to fix the problematic stuff. Yeah. So this week, they brought out a bill that, purports to do that. And I think what astonished me was, first of all, how sort of comprehensive and well-organized the rollout itself was in terms of having the bill, the minister, there were briefings, they were really trying to hit all the right levers in terms of getting the information out. And the reaction, I mean, from the civil libertarians and privacy side to the national security and the intelligence community, there were definitely some critiques. I mean, it didn't get 10 out of 10, but it seems to be running a pretty good, 8.5. And that was quite remarkable when you consider how, delicate a balance that is. So it may be recent, but I'll give them that.
Well, very quickly, what did they fix in that bill?
Well, one of the things that they did that was quite significant, I think, was create a new umbrella oversight agency. And if, you might recall, this has been sort of the long-standing criticism, which was the oversight that did exist was siloed out for different agencies and was also, arguably not particularly effective. What they're proposing is a stronger, basically an umbrella agency with some teeth. And that would go a long way to, I think, reassuring people of the possibility that these new powers that are still being given to the various levels of federal police, that there's less likelihood that those will be abused, or if they are, that they'll be caught pretty quickly. So I think that was pretty significant.
Yeah, though it's also important, I think, to remember what was left inside the bill. I've been arguing for years now that one of the most important aspects of this Liberal government is the extent to which it leaves alone the agenda of Stephen Harper's Conservative government, which many progressives thought was a direct threat a clear and present danger to democracy itself. It had to be completely undone. In fact, in foreign policy and defense policy and in national security, the Liberals are leaving the core of the Conservative agenda intact while tinkering at the edges. And I think that's true of the old C-51 as well.
I think also the world has changed since the old C-51, and it does feel more perilous. There have been so many well-publicized terrorist attacks elsewhere, not in Canada, thank God, at least except for the killings at the mosque in Quebec. There's a different kind of there's a nervousness and a wariness. So there may be a larger appetite for a more muscular or invasive kind of national security policy. Also, I just wanted to say the virtue of experience. We were talking earlier about the younger women cabinet ministers. This was Ralph Goodale's baby. This is a very experienced, very well-regarded minister who's been around for many years. And I agree with Katie. I thought he handled it seamlessly. And can I just add, I'll answer your question for once about the legislative, to me, the greatest legislative achievement of this government was the transgender rights bill, which passed in the Senate, I think, just this week. They were a little late to get on board, but when you compare what happened in Canada and how Canada handled that issue compared with how it was handled in the United States, I think it's a victory not just for the Trudeau government, but for Canadian politics.
Okay, let's go to the not so positive. What was the biggest or most damaging misstep? John.
Oh, there are actually some big ones, and I think electoral reform probably would go down as one of them. It was a key promise. It was a very explicit promise that this will be the last time we ever have an election under the old Westminster system. And no, it won't. The next election will be held under the old first-past-the-post system. So to promise anything that explicitly and then fail to keep that promise is courageous, Minister, as they used to say on Yes, Minister. Although I would say in the greater scheme of things, again, running up $30 billion deficits when you were promising to go no higher than 10, in terms both of a broken promise and in terms of the fiscal challenge that he's leaving future governments and taxpayers down the road, may, in fact, in the long run, be the bigger misstep.
Katie?
Yeah, I can't disagree with John. Electoral reform was just such a spectacular. I can't believe you got to go first. You should, But yeah, it was so blatant. It was so spectacular. And I think this is crucial too. We all kind of watched it going. It was like watching a roller coaster going down, 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 and then right off the rails. Because you could see what was going to happen like 6 months into it, but it took them that long to actually pull the plug. And on that, I actually do give the government grudging credit for at least knowing when to say, you know what, enough euphemisms, enough, tap dancing around this idea of consulting and maybe later. We just got to pull the plug here. We just got to call this one done and move on because it's torture going, inch by inch. So, I mean, on that and that alone, they handled the end of it with some grace. But yeah, in terms of just both disappointing people and wasting an enormous amount of sort of government time and resources and people investing in it, it didn't have to happen that way, and that was not spectacular.
Okay. And in terms of the sort of anemic afterlife from that electoral reform thing, it was the parliamentary reforms that were proposed, which are minor tweaks, most of them quite useful, but again, and probably would have passed without comment, except for this bullying tone that they adopted early on in the electoral reform process. I think they were quite serious when they started on the electoral reform path, but when the Conservatives dug their heels and said, we're not going to change anything without a national referendum, I think the Liberals said, privately, forget it. In any event, there was, as I say, a bullying tone, and I think it got the backs up of the opposition, and it didn't help them. But I think their worst blunder is a smaller issue, but it calls into question their whole sincerity on the Indigenous Affairs portfolio, and that is their stupefying refusal to act on Canadian Human Rights Tribunal repeated warnings that they have to fix the inequity in the way Indigenous children are treated in terms of health and social services. Cindy Blackstock's been a big champion of this issue. It's astonishing that they haven't done anything yet.
Okay, very quickly before we go to break, what are your picks for best and worst crisis management by the government? Susan, I'll start with you.
Okay, I'm just going to divert to it because I do think it was the Trump thing. I think it's the way they've handled Trump. So I'll let the others.
Okay, all right, John.
Very quickly, I would say it was how Chrystia Freeland managed Wallonia, a region of Belgium that very many Canadians didn't even know existed, and certainly that most Canadians didn't know had, for some bizarre reason, the ability to veto the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement. We could have just thrown up our hands and said, "Oh, you Europeans," and walked away. Instead, we went over there, we placated the Wallonians, and got the deal through. And congratulations to the minister for doing it.
Okay, and Katie?
I would be a little daring here. I'm going to say the House Rules debacle, which started just with, as has been already discussed here, you know, the government coming across like a bunch of bullies who were trying to force through their agenda, but they then realized that they were looking like a bunch of bullies that were trying to force through their agenda, and they backed off. And I do think governments have to be congratulated occasionally for realizing they've made a terrible mistake and going back on it, rather than just persist, rather than admit they were wrong. So I'm going to give them that one.